Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. I cannot wait to talk to today's guest, journalist Brian Karem. But first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So let me tell you a little bit about Brian. Brian Karem is a weekly columnist for Salon. He is the former executive editor for the Sentinel newspaper group and the former senior White House correspondent for Playboy Magazine. He's also a regular columnist for the Washington Diplomat and appears frequently on the country's top-rated news shows. He has covered every presidential administration since Ronald Reagan, sued Donald Trump 3 times successfully to keep his press pass, spent time in jail to protect a confidential source, covered wars in the Middle East, and is the author of 7 books. His latest is Free the Press, The Death of American Journalism and How to Revive It. He is also the host of the podcast, Just Ask the Question. Brian, welcome into the back room.
Hey, thanks for having me here, Andy. Glad to be here. Cool. What's in the back room?
You don't want to know. I've been a big admirer of yours for a while, so this is an honor to have you in here talking about your career and all the things on the political stage. But first, let me peel back the onion a little bit. Let's go back in time. Let's talk about little Brian, maybe even like single-digit Brian. Tell me where you were born and raised, what kind of family you came from. Were they politically left? Were they right? And this business that you're in for the last couple of decades or more, was there any of that growing up?
Let's see. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, to a political family. My grandfather, and a meat market family. We're immigrants from Lebanon. My family first came over to the United States with Khalil Gibran. I helped bring him over, actually, as I understand the story, the family story. Of course, my mother always said, if old Karem tells you a story, dilute it by about 300%, you'll get the truth. But or that was my grandmother, actually. So we came over and we were in New York, and someone said, hey, my great uncle had lung problems. They said, well, there's a place down south that's just like New York, and you'll like it, and the weather's better. And that was Louisville, Kentucky. Now, I have no idea how they decided that Louisville and Manhattan were the same or equivalent, but there was a farmer's market. And the rumor was that, the rumor was that on the downtown fish market, the Fulton Fish Market, my great-grandfather started out with a block of ice and 7 chickens and built his business from there. And then his son, my grandfather, went to law school and became an attorney, and then later a circuit court judge. 2 of my uncles were lawyers and representatives in Kentucky state politics. My Uncle Pete was for a while dabbled with being a Republican, but everyone was into civil rights in my family. My grandfather and grandmother marched with Martin Luther King. My grandmother was one of the first women to ever plead a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I grew up in some of the first books I learned to read were law books. And I grew up with a healthy dose of what was one of the best newspapers in the world at the time, the Courier-Journal and Louisville Times, which I read every day. At its height, it had 280,000 its circulation was 280,000. It had a staff of several hundred with bureaus in New York, D.C., London, and other places. It had a larger staff in Frankfort, Kentucky for the covering the State House, and in D.C. covering federal government than it has today in its entirety, which it sold to Gannett. It's now a 15,000 subscription rag and has 20 employees instead of several hundred. So my background was, in fact, my uncle, who dabbled in being a Republican briefly, he got out of the Republican Party because of one person, Mitch McConnell, and he was actually I went into journalism. I was an editor of my high school newspaper. And my Uncle Pete, the first politician I interviewed outside of the family was Mitch McConnell. And the night before I went in to interview him, my Uncle Pete talked to me on the phone. He said, I hear you're going to interview Mitch tomorrow. I said, yeah. And he goes, I want you to remember one thing. And I go, what's that? And he goes, Mitch McConnell is about only one thing. And I said, really? What is it? And he goes, Mitch McConnell. And it was the most succinct, damning, and exacting criticism of the man I've ever heard before or since. So that's it in a nutshell. Played a little bit of high school football and, busted up my knee. And after that, it's just been, writing. I like the idea of being sitting in the front row of history and having someone else pay for the freight. Traveling on someone else's nickel is always nice.
And you started out as a sports reporter, right?
Yeah, I started out as a photographer and sports reporter. Actually, it was when professionally I was a neighborhood. I worked for a community newspaper in high school, but my first professional job, was down in Texas as a sports reporter in Conroe, Texas, and then went on to be the sports editor, and then left that, went down to Laredo and covered the border, which was it's still a hot topic today, but was even more so back then.
Yeah, well, that's because brown people are always scary, no matter whatever decade you pick. It's always the scary brown people that get all the attention. My
favorite story of that, covering that, I was, Ronald Reagan came out and said that the Sandinistas were only an hour away from our border by plane or hook or crook or whatever. And so there was an old station wagon that showed up at the border, and 10 people hopped out from the KKK. They claimed that they represented 100 people each. And so there was, they were representing thousands that would show up to make sure the Sandinistas didn't cross the border. They even had their little white robes. And so as they're standing there protesting the border, the League of Urban Latin American Citizens, LULAC, showed up, and they didn't show up with one person representing 100 each. They showed up with about 200 people and literally rode the KKK out of town, not on a rail, but scared the hell out of them. I never saw people get in a station wagon fly so fast in all my life. So yeah, there's always they always project fear about people who have, darker colored skin, which is how I grew up too. You grew up Lebanese in Louisville, Kentucky, and I got called a lot of things and a lot of racial slurs, and half the time they were wrong, but you just got used to it after a while. The only one I would always correct them and go, no, if you're going to do that, I'm a towelhead. Just go there.
Wait, wasn't it a liberal bastion like Manhattan?
It was. Louisville was and is the only place that would tolerate Mitch McConnell, and there is a small portion of Louisville that's kind of like Greenwich Village, but you get out in the suburbs in Louisville, man, and you see what you're really facing in the South. Yeah. So it's not all that tolerant.
So you spent about a year, I think, as a sports reporter before deciding politics was what you really wanted to do.
Well, I liked sports. I like covering sports. I always have, but I always liked politics was more in my blood, and so, I've covered a lot of stuff over the years. And I got that from, again, from the family. I guess, my dad grew up, one of his childhood friends was Hunter Thompson. And so, I read a lot of his stuff, and he, you can't read the Kentucky Derby as decadent and depraved, or Fear and Loathing at the Super Bowl, or Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, or Fear and Loathing on the campaign trail and not be affected by that. So, yeah, I like to cover everything, but politics is in my blood.
And in your early years, you covered the Gulf War. I mean, you were there, right? What was that like, being a war correspondent?
It's probably it's the most satisfying and probably, it's definitely among the most dangerous, unless you're covering the White House during the Trump years, things that you'll ever do. But it's very, there was a great saying by H.L. Mencken that, the satisfaction in being a journalist doesn't come in money. It comes in, the experience. And so people can tell you what they think is going on, but when you're there and see it with your own eyes, man, that really, it opens your eyes. And I learned a lot covering the Gulf War. It was an experience that you can't be repeated.
Hmm.
hopefully.
Did you ever have any experiences that were life-threatening? Like you really thought
Oh yeah.
it was over?
Well, yeah, that happened in Ukraine last year too. But yeah, during the Gulf War, there was a time we got stuck and we ran out of gas. I had been driving most of the time. I turned the car over to my partner so I could get a little bit of sleep. I said, "There's a station up ahead to get gas. Stop and get gas." He forgot, and then the car broke down and ran out of gas in the middle of it, almost like a tank. Well, it was a tank battle. So I got I got a ride from a passing Bedouin, and I knew enough Arabic. I know enough Arabic to get shot, but I also know enough to get to communicate effectively. So I got the gas, got back, had to pay him a bit of money to do it, and then we had the gas filter was clogged because of sand. I had to take that out and reverse, with reverse pressure, blow through it and blow out all the sand, put it back on, and we got out of there. And
Hmm.
that was pretty hairy. That was not a good time, but we got out of it. Still here.
Hmm. I mean, just listening to that story, like back then, when we weren't able to like take our phones and go, "Hey Siri, where's the next gas station?" Right? Like, how did you even know that there was a gas station up ahead? Like, were you like
Well,
driving
we
through the
had
middle of Fallujah or something, wherever you were? Like,
it was Tap Line Road. It was the border road between we were driving between Dhahran and where this combat support hospital was near Rafah, and I had made the trek a couple of times already, and so I knew
okay.
where we were in the middle of the desert. And like I said, it was that's a humbling experience,
Hmm.
being out there and oh, you think you're badass? Welcome to real life.
Hmm.
And I remember my partner, I'm going, he goes, I go, crap, I think, the fuel filter's clogged. And he goes, well, do we call AAA out here? And I'm going, what are you nuts? I'm going to have to take the filter out. And I go, don't you know how to fix cars? And he goes, no, I just know how to drive them. And I'm going, oh boy, am I glad I grew up a poor kid in Kentucky because I know how to fix them. I actually had a Gremlin and a 71 Pinto. Just don't hit it in the rear. So
Yeah, remember that, the exploding Pintos.
yeah, the exploding and the Gremlin looked like somebody cut off half the car.
Yeah. This is something that few people know about you. In 1990, you were part of a Supreme Court case, which went on to be a
Yeah.
landmark case. You were jailed multiple times for refusing to divulge your confidential sources. The case is Karem versus Priest. It went to the Supreme Court. It's now a textbook case. Tell us about that.
Well, that was I was covering crime in San Antonio at the time, which was popular at the time, and had been a lot of police officer involved shootings. Was following, which was a year or two after a very historic and decadent case of a cop who was a vigilante killer. So the police were under scrutiny. They had been involved in a couple of shootings in the last week at the time. So I left our overnight photographer instructions that if there's a shooting involving a cop, call me. So I got the call about 1 a.m., rode to the scene. It was an officer-involved shooting, but the officer had been shot. And the story was that two Hispanic kids on the quote-unquote wrong side of town, in other words, the white side of town,
Hmm.
had been pulled over for nefarious reasons and had extracted the officers, had gotten in a fight with the officer, shot him with his own weapon. Um, and he had been shot up underneath his vest, and they said it was, two guys just pummeling the crap out of an innocent officer. I saw him get into the EMS. He waved. I thought he would be all right. He died.
Mm.
6 or 7 blood transfusions, or 67 blood trans. It was a lot of blood transfusions later. So the police are talking about getting these kids and extracting police, street justice. They were going to shoot him and kill him for killing one of their own. So I knew who I found out who their attorney was, and the attorney was trying to get him to negotiate a peaceful surrender. I said, if you manage to do that and they want to talk, here's, my card. They did turn themselves in. The police were upset that they didn't get a chance to shoot them. And so I got the call, and I recorded the conversation with the young man who was accused of being the shooter. He said, yes, that he did shoot the officer, but the officer had initiated the squabble with him, and that they had been pulled over for no good reason, and that they were just defending themselves. Now, you listen to that and you go, well, if you're guilty, you're probably going to say that anyway. But I aired, that night on it was Channel 4, KMOL TV, that interview where he admitted that he shot the officer, but said he did it in self-defense. It was a breaking story, of course. And the next thing you know, I get all kinds of subpoenas telling me to show up in court. I'm being threatened. The prosecutor says she believes in the First Amendment, just not in my case, which I found is a common denominator. Later, many years later, I found out was a common denominator among many cases where police or prosecutors jail reporters. But then as the story unraveled, it turned out that the police officer had been speedballing the night of his confrontation. He had, even though he had all the blood transfusion, he had traces of cocaine and heroin in his bloodstream, including in his fingernails and bones. So he had been a junkie, apparently, for a while. And the idea of that he had been pulled over for any reason, that the gentleman, the young man, and his brother who had been pulled over were pulled over for any reason other than to pick on them because they were Hispanic. There was no reason for pulling them over. They said they were driving a suspicious vehicle on 410. And what's a suspicious vehicle? What does that mean? I mean, was there signs hanging out the door? I hate cops, or I'm going to kill people. There was no reason. It was just he didn't like the car, saw two Hispanic kids, pulled them over, started a fight, got killed. So that I got jailed 4 times for that. It did go up to the Supreme Court. And there was a justice who's no longer on the Supreme Court, as I don't think any of them are left that was there then, who put it before a vote just to let me out of jail to proceed, because it was up at the Supreme Court level, just to let me out of jail while we tried the case. And the 5-4, they wouldn't let me out. And so I was looking at basically spending life in prison for keeping my mouth shut, because I wouldn't name the source that had connected me to the young man who confessed. And that was his sister, and she had a reason for not wanting to come forward. She put the call through that night to me from jail with the aid of a jailer. I mean, there were 2 or 3 people that helped me get this interview that we recorded, and she didn't want to come forward because she feared that the father, she was living in the house at the time, she feared the father of the 2 boys were going to beat her up. So I kept my mouth shut. When she moved to California, she came forward. That's eventually what got me sprung out of jail, was her coming forward. Otherwise, we may not be having this talk. I might still be in jail because they didn't want to let me out for any reason, come hell or high water.
That's a crazy story. The idea of maintaining confidentiality with sources is such a big issue among the media, and it's certainly been challenged way more, and would be challenged way more, by Trump and Trump 2.0.
That's the big problem is, and I've spoken out for shield laws all across the country. I helped Jamie Raskin with the current version of it. It's at the national level. He credited me for being the inspiration for it, and I thank him for it. I hope there were, but the truth of the matter is, you can't have a free press unless you can keep your sources confidential. But the key is you have to be able to vet your sources. You have to be able to vet the information, and people have to trust you. And that trust in journalism is gone.
Sure.
And it's because of the government, and it started with Ronald Reagan, and the destruction of the free press certainly began there, and it continues to this day. And I've got to tell you that, Trump was one of the big ones who definitely did not want to see a free press.
Right. So let's get into that, because when Trump became president, there was a handful of reporters like you and Jim Acosta and others who spoke truth to power to a president who didn't really appreciate that. And so you had an episode in August of 2019 where you got suspended. This involved Sebastian Gorka.
I didn't know him then. I haven't spoken to him since, although he's tried to engage. I don't care. I just know him as the fish oil salesman. He was the guy. I told him to get a job, and then a week later he was selling fish oil or something, and somebody in the press room said, "Hey, Brian, what do you think of Gorka getting a job selling fish oil?" And I said, "Well, I told him to get a job. I guess he took it to heart." But it started because the president had a meeting out in the Rose Garden, and it was an event for social media that supported Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the press, we weren't seated. We never were. We were behind a rope line. We're standing there, and we had to listen to him. I wasn't really planning on even going out there that day, but because I didn't think it would be anything productive. But I did go. I was asked by my editor, "Hey, would you just go out there and listen and see if there's anything worth putting in your column this week?" This was at Playboy at the time, and I said, "Yeah, sure." So out I went, trotted out there. And at the end, he had called on or spoke a little bit, and then had a couple of social influencers, media influencers, speak up. And then he started to walk away. I said, "Hey, Mr. President, would you mind sticking around and take a few questions for the rest of the press?" And then someone turned around and said, "He's already spoken to the real press." And I made the smart ass comment. I said, "Wow, looks like there's a lot of people here," and I did it in a Rodney voice. I said, "who are eager to be, demonically possessed." And so that prompted a laugh from the ones who had asked him. But this guy that I didn't know came over, started screaming that I was a punk. They had already gone after Jim Acosta for his book. They had made a couple other disparaging comments to other members of the media. And I just wasn't in the mood to take it. It was the same as when his first press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, came out. It was 6 months into the administration when she came out and told us that we were all fake. We're all standing there, and she calls us a bunch of fake media, and then says, and take a look at this video. I don't know if it's true or not. It was, but she wanted us to take a look at a falsified piece of video that bolstered what Trump was saying. And I said, "Look, man," I said, "we're here. We don't have a choice. We're stuck with you." I said, "But they can turn us off or turn the channel or read something else. So quit calling us fake media. We're all just sitting here trying to do our job, and you know it." And I got tired of that kind of duplicitous behavior out of them. And so this guy's coming over and he's screaming and ranting and raving, and I just wasn't in the mood to take it. I said, "Brother, we can sit here and talk, or we can go outside and talk all day." And I wasn't going to sit there and fight him in the Rose Garden, but that raised Trump's. That was pretty much it. I mean, we were waiting to get out, and there's a picture of me pointing at him like this, next to the double doors that let us in and out of the palm room doors that let us in and out of the White House there. And so that was pretty much it. And the next thing I know,
you got suspended.
Well, yeah, that didn't happen right away. That happened like 3 or 4 days later. It was the one press secretary that he had, Stephanie, whatever her name was, that wouldn't never had a press conference or a briefing for an entire year while she was the press secretary. The only thing she did was suspend my press pass, and I found out about it that morning. Trump had left and had one of his famous chopper talk sessions. And people always said, "How did that start?" And I go, "Well, it was my fault. I saw him walk out of the White House one day within the first 4 months. It was like in March of when he came in 2021. And he was walking out of the White House, and we were all standing behind the rope line on the South Lawn. And I swear to God, and as God is my witness, I saw him walk out of the West Wing, out of his office, the Oval Office, and he had on that white suit, the red tie, the dark, the dark suit, and his hair was blowing in the wind. And for all the world, he looked like Rodney Dangerfield to me. I couldn't help it. I started.
Well, he does think he never gets any respect. So,
yeah. And he started waving, right? He started waving, and he would always just wave and walk to the chopper, and that was it. And that day, as he's waving and walking to the chopper, I said, "Oh, I'm telling you, tough room, Mr. President. What the hell?" And he turned around and he looked at me. He goes, "Playboy, what do you got?" And that was the beginning of chopper talk. So that one day I'm sitting there, and he took he would always take questions from me. The thing that people don't understand is that he just liked to fight. And I wasn't there. And then they would turn around and make it about us, that we wanted to be the focus of attention. No, we're not important. It's the questions that are important. Mm-hmm. So I always try to remember to ask him a decent question, because that's what really is important. Our faces aren't. We can be replaced. And sometimes we're replaced by people who don't ask good questions, and that's a different issue. But, so I asked him a question. He took 2 questions from me that day. One of them was on the Middle East. I forget what the other one was. And then when I got back to my office, I was told that I got an email and said I was suspended, that I wouldn't be let back into the White House because I had pissed off the president, and I had acted in an unprofessional manner. And then that went to court 3 times, and we beat. Thanks to Ted Boutros, the best First Amendment attorney in the country. I will never stop thanking him. We challenged it in court. We won in court. We won on appeal. We won on another appeal. It was on its way to the Supreme Court when he left office. And so that one didn't go to the Supreme Court, but we beat his ass 3 times in court.
Well, speaking of interesting and important questions, I want to play something for you, which is a very important question you did ask Trump 6 weeks before the 2020 election.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. President, real quickly, win, lose, or draw in this election, will you commit here today for a peaceful transferal of power after the election? And there has been rioting in Louisville. There's been rioting in many cities across this country, red and your so-called red and blue states. Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
I understand that, but people are rioting. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it. And you know who knows it better than anybody else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else. Go ahead.
I remember watching that. I can't imagine what went through your mind when you were asking what is a normal question, an obvious question, and the answer you got back was fucking insanity. What was the first thing that went through your mind listening to that response?
Holy shit. And what was funny was the person who followed up didn't even follow up on that question, but asked about the prince and his Marco or whatever, Mark, whatever, I can't remember her name. Yeah, asked about her, and he just I was looking around going, did anybody else hear what I mean? God, am I alone? And it was that day was a really odd day to begin with. I wasn't in the pool rotation. It was during COVID, and you couldn't be in that room unless you were, there were 14 seats instead of 49. So I would stand in the back, and usually it was Kayleigh McEnany or whoever was left that would, preach to us, and I would shout out a question at the end, just trying to get it on the record. That was, just ask the question. That was my recommendation from one of my mentors, Helen Thomas, who said, Brian, it doesn't matter if they answer. It doesn't matter what their answer is. Ask the question. Just ask the question, because then they can't deny that it's been brought up to them if it's on the record. So that's always been my, that was always my guiding light there. So, I was determined just to stand in the back room and shout a question out. But at the last moment, there was an empty seat. One of the people who was supposed to be there that day didn't show up. So it was either me or the Epoch whatever Times or OAN was going to get that seat. So I sat down first. I wasn't going to let anybody else have that seat. And so I raised my hand as he got done speaking, not knowing whether or not he'd ever call on me. But he called on me first. So I go, well, here we go. Let's go to the rodeo.
What do you got, Playboy? Playboy, what you got for me today?
You got Playboy, go ahead.
That's not bad, actually. Oh, you're doing Seth Meyers Trump, which I do Seth.
Yeah,
Meyers
that's
Trump.
yeah. Yeah, it's hard to do. I spent a lot of time around him. I consider him batshit nuts. And I actually, honestly, Andy, I'll tell you the truth. If Donald Trump weren't in a position of power, I would feel sorry for him. I've known people like him who are just so wrapped up in their own world, and they're really kind of pathetic. And he is a pathetic person. And I am angry with him because he has been enabled because of his money, and he's assembled people who follow him as acolytes, who are even less have less backbone than he does, and he leans on them. And so I have empathy for him as a human being. I have no sympathy for what he's done or what he's going through or what he's put us through. And he's a fascinating and yet terrifying study of humanity.
Right. So you're sitting there in the White House press room. You got a seat. He calls on you. You ask that question, right? I mean, it was an astounding moment in history, because he really was basically saying, well, if you stop the voting and the counting, then, yeah.
Like I said, I said, holy shit. What the, and look where we are today.
Yeah. Well, he was
told us
telegraphing
where we were going to be.
Exactly.
Right there.
Yeah.
That was it. He would not accept that there was the insurrection, which I was there for that day. This is everything that he's done since. It's the election denial, and he's got millions of people believing it because he keeps repeating a lie, and he knows that there are certain people that will believe that lie, including members of Congress who have nothing without him. They couldn't get elected. They would have no money.
Well, his attacks on the media are clear. He's called the media the enemy of the people. So you wrote a book in 2022 called Free the Press, The Death of American Journalism and How to Revive It. And you also recently put out an article in Salon called The Media is Missing the Real Battle. The book and the article both kind of speak to the same thing, which is the importance of the media, the power of the media, the role and the job it should be doing, especially when the media is so truly under fire right now. Do you see the media putting up the right battle? Do you see the media winning that battle? Or do you think the media is facing an existential crisis, even without Trump becoming president again? But what if he does become president again? What happens to the media?
Well, if he does become president again, it's over with. Not just the media, but the entire country as we know it. That's the existential crisis. The existential crisis in the media today is horrifying. As I said, it started with Ronald Reagan, and every president since has been complicit in it. It is the constriction of the media. It is the elimination of reporters. And I talked earlier about the Courier-Journal and what it has become. I will remind people that the rise of Mitch McConnell coincides with the demise of the Courier-Journal when it was sold to Gannett. Here was a family-owned newspaper. To get the Courier-Journal's endorsement, you sat before a board of about 6 people who interviewed you incessantly for an hour. If you were a politician and wanted to be endorsed as a candidate for the Courier, and they did this with everyone from local to state to federal offices. They were relentless in reporting and investigating the people who represented us in office. And so there were people who hated the Courier. They said it was, too left-wing, too liberal, but they loved the endorsement because they knew it meant something. So then they sell out to Gannett, who immediately cuts staff and cuts service, and here comes Mitch McConnell. And you go from a paper of 280,000 people circulation to a paper today that's a shadow of itself. The American media is a shadow of itself. There's the All-In Group, I call it a vulture capital group, that owns several hundred newspapers. There's Sinclair, who owns several hundred maybe it's 100 now, television stations. Then there's iHeartRadio, which has destroyed local radio. All of this constriction in the business can be represented by some very significant numbers. There's probably almost 3 times the number of people on this planet is on the day that I was born, and there's a quarter of the number of reporters. That's the problem. And it was Ben Bagdikian from the Washington Post who said, listen, if you want true diversity of thought, you have to have diversity of ownership. That's not what you have today. When I got into the business, there were a couple of dozen companies who owned and operated 80% of what you see, read, or hear. Today, 95% of what you see, read, or hear are owned by 6 companies. And I'll guarantee you there's no liberal bias in those boardrooms of those. So there's basically what, maybe 100 people, 120 people across this country dictating what 95% of what you see, read, or hear in the news. And it's all driven by money. All of this is about money. All of it is about the constriction is to create monopolies. And, Ronald Reagan said that will create efficiency, and it doesn't. What it does is create, his trickle down, people who support his tinkle down theory of economics. And so it's destroyed American journalism. We are in an existential crisis. If Donald Trump comes back, we're done. The country's done. But barring that, if there is a second administration from Biden who has already come out for unions and against monopolies, I'd like to see him, since he will not have to face another election. I want a presidential blue ribbon commission to sit down and talk about how we break up media monopolies, encourage minority ownership, encourage, a nonprofit news, reinvest in the news. I've been looking at a newspaper myself, purchasing, and one of the questions asked me is, what are you going to do with profits? Are you going to keep them or reinvest them in the company? And it was Barry Bingham Sr. who ran the Courier-Journal, and I'll remind everyone what a great guy this guy was. Over the elevators going into the offices was a saying from his father that said, I have always thought of these newspapers as a public trust and have endeavored to run them that way. He took a lower profit margin in order to reinvest in his newspapers to guarantee that they would serve the public. Today, we're too worried about getting as much money as we can, as quickly as we can, and running the business into the ground, and that's not sustainable. Journalism, and I'm sorry, I'm a happy capitalist. You mentioned the book I wrote, buy early, buy often, buy as many of them as you want. I want you to. But when it comes to news, capitalism and news doesn't work together, because I'll guarantee you the stuff that we need to report on is going to piss off some of the people who own capital. That's just the way it is. That's why we're here. That's why there's so little reporting done today, is the constriction of, you can get me ranting on that for an hour. I'll stop right now.
So we have a big election coming up in November. I want to ask you about Trump and what you think is the likelihood of him becoming president again. We had some breaking news this morning in the Georgia case, which was, I think, pretty huge. Where do you think his legal troubles are, in a meaningful, direct, tangible way, going to factor into the outcome of that election?
I think people that are waiting for that to happen are delusional. The thing that you have to, this is an article I wrote actually this week for Salon. He may not be prosecuted or be in prison, probably won't be in prison by November. I have always said that I don't even know if he'll be on the ballot in November. And I still don't know, though. The actuarial tables may get him. He's one cheeseburger away from keeling over on stage. He could go up there, have a mental lock, and go Feffy, and then be gone.
Well, I just want to say for the record, there are plenty of other people saying from your mouth to whose ears.
I'm just saying, well, those are the actuarial tables, and that's his, and I was there, by the way, the day that he came out with his with Dr. Ronnie Jackson saying that he could live to be 200. And I read the report. I'm standing next to Sanjay Gupta. He's looking at the report. My dad had heart disease. He knows what heart disease is. I'm reading the numbers. I'm going, this guy's got heart disease. And he goes, you're right. Are you a doctor? I go, no, but my dad had it. So, I kind of know what this is, an elevated cat. So, the idea he's going to live to be 200, bull. That aside, if the actuarial tables don't get him, I don't think you count on the prison or those legal efforts to make sure that Donald Trump isn't in office. I think the only reasonable way to approach Donald Trump going into November is to vote. The biggest problem in this country is that we consider 50 to 55% voter turnout a good voter turnout.
Sure.
That's bull.
It's crazy.
And many other developed democracies, 75%. Let's go for that, shall we?
I say that all the
Because
time.
here's the simple fact. There are more registered Democrats than registered Republicans. The difference is the Republicans will vote because, as a minority party, they know they have to turn out if they want to get their people in. Democrats, not so much, and they always snatch, defeat out of the jaws of victory. This should be a no-brainer. Joe, look, I don't care about the age of either one of these people. Here's what you have to choose from. Do you want a seditious traitor who's been impeached twice, is facing, 88 felony counts now, he had some of them dropped, has been sued successfully, owes $500 million. Where's he going to get that money from? Hello, Putin? That's this is a dangerous man. He is dangerous to democracy. Now, whether or not you believe with some of his policies, that's a different matter. If you believe in some of his policies, you still can't believe in the man because he's delusional, and you're deluded if you believe that he's going to come out and fight for you. He's running for office to stay out of prison. It's his best chance to do it. So keep that, all the prison talk, all the, the money that he owes in the background, and focus on turning out the vote. And Democrats, if you don't like, the president's policy in the Middle East, I get it. I have family there. I understand. If you don't like the president because he's come out for this or that, whatever reason the Democrats want to find, he's too moderate, he's too liberal, he's too conservative. Your choice is between the seditious traitor and an old guy who has sleep apnea and is nursing a broken foot. Which one are you going to choose? I mean, if they talk, it's all lies. Donald Trump is built on a hill of lies, a mountain of them. Biden, what has he done for the country? Well, good Lord, I went through, and I'm not partisan. This is not me being partisan. This is me just saying the truth and facts. The fact is, for 4 years, Donald Trump kept telling us that we were going to have, today is infrastructure week. We walk in every Monday morning. It's infrastructure week in the White House. I'm going, really? What infrastructure? I can't even get the toilets to work. So, he's talking infrastructure, doing nothing. This guy passes $1 trillion, go outside of this country for a moment and look and see what a first world country is really like. In Europe, they're arguing over, oh gosh, where are we going to go for tea? Because I have free education, I have free health care, and I can take the bullet train. Where do we have that in the U.S.? Where do we have infrastructure? Where do we have a high-speed rail? Where do we have, tell me a city or a state in this country that doesn't have major problems on highways. I drove I-70 from L.A. to D.C., and I can tell you there are parts of that in Colorado that look like a 2-lane dirt road. I-70, the interstate, is in such disrepair. There are roads and bridges that are falling apart. And this is the guy, Biden, who got infrastructure passed. He, by the way, supports, I don't know, a woman's right to choose. 70% of the people in this country support that. Most of them being women, of course. But that, for the love of God, there's no choice. If you're going to go down to it, just get out and vote. Get out and drive your friends to the polls and make sure voter suppression doesn't work, and volunteer to help at the polls so you don't have MAGA members doing it and screwing up the count, suppressing votes, and engaging in voter fraud. That's the challenge. Get out and vote and get Donald Trump sitting on the sidelines for the rest of his life. I don't care if he goes to prison. I think he deserves to be there for the rest of his life, but he can never step foot in the White House again, or this country is done. And if you don't understand that, you're his mark, and he's going to grift you for every cent that you have. And I remind people that, that all the time I hear from people, MAGA members, who go, well, the economy isn't so great under Biden. I go, well, let me ask you a question. Do you give money to Donald Trump? He goes, yeah, I'd give him about $150 a week. I go, well, maybe if you didn't do that, your economy would be a little bit better. Because there's...
Oh my God. You know, I say it all the time. You're 100% right about turnout. And especially when you break it down even further and you look at Gen Z, people under 30 perhaps, how maybe 30% of them vote. When you think about saving democracy, you think about climate, you think about choice, when you think about mass shootings and school shootings, Gen Z should be turning out 90%, right? I don't understand why in this country, just overall, we have 55% or so voter turnout with the issues that we're facing. You know?
Yeah, and then there would be no argument about Donald Trump. How in the hell can there be? You look at the polls. How the hell can this election be that close? Part of it is Biden is horrible at messaging. My biggest criticism of this administration is they don't know how to put a message out. I was once told, well, we covered that last week. I go, you don't get it. You got to cover it every day. If you don't suck up the oxygen in the room, Donald Trump will, because he's got nothing but gas in his tank and he'll spew it. I mean, he's just a molten lava spewing forth his garbage, and he will battle you at every turn if you do not get out and tell people the facts and the truth. And it goes in one ear and out the other.
Yeah. No, my current episode is with Pete Souza, former White House photographer for Obama. And one of the most interesting things that came up in that conversation is that he thought that the White House, not the photographer himself, who he thought was doing a good job, but the White House wasn't using the right images that could reshape the narrative that Joe Biden is too old. You know, instead of just like canned selfie kind of things, just working and traveling, like just as a robust, energetic president, you know, where age doesn't matter.
You're so right. And they get pissed off when I say it, but it's the truth. I'm sorry. This is what really frustrates me, Andy. I've been in the same room within 5 feet of both of these presidents. And I can tell you, the one with dementia is not Joe Biden. That he may be old. He may forget a few. Hey, look, there's times when I forget people's names, right? That's common. But Donald Trump is a different animal entirely, and he is. And I saw trembling in it. I remember when Neil Gorsuch was up on stage and Donald Trump was, this was introducing Gorsuch as the newest Supreme Court justice. And I remember there was a palsy, a tremor in his hand, and he was even shaking back then. And he looked at me, and every once in a while he would turn and look at me and go, yeah, I'm sorry. What are we dating now? What is this? What is this wink? What the hell are you doing? Well, it was almost, it was weird. But I have been. Biden actually he's answered every question I've ever been able to ask him. And the problem, I said to one of their press handlers a while back, I said, that you ought to have me in the room more often with him because he'll answer my questions. And they go, that's precisely why we don't want you in the room with him.
Right.
And that they protect him way too much. I told this to Jen Psaki. I've told this to Karem. I have said, and I will maintain, that the best person to talk about the policies of this administration is no one that we see on a daily basis. The best person is Joe Biden. Now, I remember him years ago. I was in a couple of scrums with him in the Senate. One of my favorite, my first time I ran into him, I was doing a story. One of the books that I wrote was on Tom Capano, a killer in Delaware, who had named every high-ranking Delaware official, including the governor at the time, Tom Carper, who's now the senator, Joe Biden, all of them being complicit in some kind of sex scam and it was all bullshit because, Tom he tried to blame an ex-girlfriend for killing this girl. Turned out he killed her and dumped her, in the ocean off of Toms River, New Jersey. Just a really weird guy trying to blame Biden for some stuff that Biden had nothing to do with. But I'm doing my due diligence. I show up in Congress and get, here's Biden walking out. He's talking in a scrum. And I said, hey, are you good friends with Tom Capano? Because he said that you all were involved together in some stuff. And he goes, I don't even know Tom Soprano. And which, the Sopranos were popular at the time. I took it as a pretty good joke. There was a guy standing next to me reporting. He goes, that's, Joe Biden always gaffes. He's a stutterer and a gaffer. All right. He may be a stutterer. He is a gaffer. But that was actually pretty funny. So, I mean, I know then that Joe Biden and I see the Joe Biden now.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, if he was asked as he's walking to the helicopter, you giving up anything for Lent? And he goes, yeah, you. And I'm going, there's a guy who's still got it, man.
Mm-hmm.
But, not Trump going, well, if you quit counting the votes. I mean, that guy is delusional. That guy is demented.
So the last clip I want to play for you is this.
I'm waiting for the man. Here it comes, all dressed in black. See us soon, baby. Look at your head.
That is not Lou Reed, and that is not the Velvet Underground. That, my friend, is you and your band, the Rhythm Bandits Band. I'm a drummer, so you're talking to someone who identifies.
I need a drummer. I had a gig on March 23rd in D.C. I had to cancel because my drummer dropped out. I didn't know. Gosh darn it.
There you go. Well, you know now. That looks like a lot of fun. It looks like you are having the most fun of your life when you do that.
Yeah, it keeps me happy. Look, rock and roll is good for the soul. I've been playing music, singing since I was in high school. I gave it up for years when you raise the kids. My wife and I decided I wouldn't be in a band and I wouldn't drive a motorcycle. That's when the kids were growing up because they needed a dad around. I stopped, being a pilot and flying airplanes. So I gave those things up. And then after the kids grew up, I said, screw it. I'm going back to the motorcycle, flying airplanes and playing in a rock band. Mm-hmm. And that does it. Like I said, rock and roll is really good for the soul. I love it.
All right. So my last question to you on that note, we always like to ask this question because we like to try to get a window into people's souls. And oftentimes the best way to do that is through music. So give me your top 5 musical artists of all time.
Well, the Beatles.
Oh,
without
finally.
A doubt.
It took 179 episodes for me to get that answer. And I say that as a huge Beatles fan. Yes, you'd be surprised. I have people say things like, okay, Wham. I'm like, Wham? Really? Wham? Not the Beatles?
Wham?
Like, what? Yeah. Like, it's unbelievable how infrequently people include the Beatles in their top 5.
But then they don't know the fact that the Beatles created entire reams of what you listen to today.
Of course.
So I'm sorry, it starts with the Beatles. Buddy Holly,
mm-hmm.
Dave Brubeck,
mm-hmm.
Mozart,
mm-hmm.
And then
Wham.
I can't. No, maybe Snoop Dogg, but
all right, that works for me.
Not Wham. I'll go with Snoop. I liked him on Monk.
All right.
And he's always getting high. You gotta like that guy. So
and he worked and he collabed with Martha Stewart. I mean, come on. I mean, who's better than Snoop?
That's you gotta like. And I
Full
like
circle.
His music. And then I did listen to a while to a Tribe Called Quest, but that's and then I guess if I in the rock and roll genre, other than the Beatles and Buddy Holly, Tom Petty.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. That's a good list. That's probably could be my favorite list so far of anyone. And you didn't say Taylor Swift, which is interesting because she's on everyone's list, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah. Really.
I look, I give her props for writing her own music, but Haters Gonna Hate doesn't really compare to, turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. It's just, I don't, to me it doesn't.
I mean, I don't dislike her. I think she's great as a person.
Her.
I think she's certainly incredibly commercially, hugely successful. But it's just interesting when you ask people give the top 5 and things that come up and not the Beatles.
How can the Beatles not come up, man?
Well, we're going to end on that note because that is the most important question. Brian, this was a lot of fun. Hopefully in a couple of months you come back and we'll get an update on your thoughts on the election and how it's going because this year is going to be absolutely crazy.
It's going to be tough.
Yeah. And if you ever decide to pack it all in and be an impressionist, I think you got a second career there. You do some good stuff.
I was an ugly child too,
That's actually really good. Yeah, go for it. We have Matt Friend on all the time, and he does amazing impressions. But I got to say, you're up there. All right, my friend. Thanks for coming on again. You've been generous with your time, and I look forward to the next one.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.